All right, Emily, what are we talking about today?
Increasing your income via career changes and negotiating raises, identity theft, and setting up children for financial success.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. All right, well, this is 2 weeks in a row now that you're asking about like career job stuff. So I know you said you're not looking for a new job, but I'm starting to get a little bit suspicious. Then again, I don't think you have hidden secret children to set up for success. And I don't know, identity theft can happen to anybody. So it's anybody's game. Take us away. What do you actually want to ask about here?
All right, we're starting with the switching jobs thing just to ease your mind and get it out of the way. It doesn't mean
Thank you.
anything, but I'm curious about it. Plenty of people ask us about it in meetings or it's happening to them. And, several people in my personal life, as well as clients, I see them stay in the same job for a long time and very slowly work their way up through the company. And there's something to be said for that. But it seems like people that switch companies more frequently move up faster. Is that true?
I think it's dependent on the person's career path and tracks. Like in certain fields, that wouldn't do you much good. In other fields, it's a really good strategy. So to compare, for somebody who, for example, wants to be like a tenure track full professor, it does not make any sense to like switch colleges back and forth unless you feel like you're stuck or you've got a bad program or something where you're not going to get tenure. But at the same time, in a field like software engineering, where the skill is highly fungible, company to company, product to product, as long as it's in the same coding languages or you have the applicable experience, then it makes a lot more sense to potentially do career shifts every couple of years or company switches every couple of years, simply because the biggest risk that somebody is presented with in any career path is that there's a person above you who is blocking the way, who is not going to get out of the way because they don't want to promote, they're not able to promote, or they're happy where they are, or they like their position. And most companies have some version of a pyramidal shape in which there's less and less positions and opportunities as you go up. And so if the person, your manager, your boss, or just the expert above you isn't going to move on or move out of the way, then you might find yourself stuck way longer in a position than your experience and your capabilities might suggest would be appropriate for you, making it so that you either then have to look for other opportunities in the company or go elsewhere or be really patient, which at a certain level is not in your interest.
So it doesn't look bad on your resume if you bounce around quite a bit like that, or it's fine if you only do it, maybe every 2 years.
I think it depends firm by firm, industry by industry, what the norms are. Like people in software, particularly who like work in startups, tend to change all the time because their occupation is highly volatile in terms of like the survivability of the companies they work for. On the other hand, I know that there are many business owners out there who do frown upon job hopping. Sort of the comparison of, let's say, hiring a lawyer who's been with one firm for the last 3 years or hiring a lawyer who has been with three different firms in the last 3 years. And I think this largely can come from sort of a personal bias standpoint in which we have not job hopped or we have job hopped. And so we tend to sort of project our feelings about that onto others. I can list a bunch of good reasons not to hire job hoppers, and I can list a bunch of good reasons to do so. I think at the end of the day, it is highly circumstantial. You should just know that there are many companies that won't hire you if you change jobs too frequently, but the inverse is seldom true. I don't see a lot of companies looking at somebody being like, wow, you were there for 10 years and now you're looking for a new opportunity. I don't know. You were there for a long time.
Right. That makes sense. If you are looking to transfer jobs and move around, is there certain things you can do to make yourself more valuable as you're going through that process?
Well, I think the biggest thing here is that for job changes in the way that we're talking about, often what we're describing is sort of a diagonal move upwards on the career path. So, instead of trying to get my boss's job at the current company, I'm going to try to get the equivalent to my boss's job somewhere else because I'm ready to move up or I have the experience and so on. And so I think it's very helpful to have a good track record in your capacity to then move up into that position. Your tenure in your current position can be helpful there. Certain credentials or expertise items, whether it's education or certificates, whatever the case is, can also be very helpful in projecting that you are ready to make this move up rather than doing an internal hire or something like that at another company. I think in turn, the big thing to keep in mind is the frequency sometimes is not in your control, right? Maybe you started a job and then the company goes through layoffs 3 months later. And so now there's this sudden turnover on your resume that you're going to have to explain. And some people may hold against you at a resume level before you get to an interview. So you do have to sort of think about the narrative of your career. And I think it's very valuable for anybody applying for jobs to not only have a cover letter that can sort of briefly explain your story, but to also be very well prepared to tell your story in an interview to help somebody understand, oh, you are looking for a new job, but you already have a job somewhere else. So why are we having this conversation? Is this a step up for you? Is this a step over for you? Is this a step down or a career change? I think it's very helpful to be able to articulate the why behind those career changes rather than letting people draw their own conclusions from just an arbitrary set of dates on a piece of paper.
Right. So if you're going to do this, you better have a good cover letter. Is it I do know one person in my personal life that has done this, but then when they got a better offer, they let their current job know and kind of negotiated a better pay scale and everything and just stayed where they're at. Is that, I don't know, I kind of feel weird about it, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Is that common?
I think it's more common as time goes on. In the same sense that I just talked about people having a bias against people job hopping, I have a little bit of a bias against that. I think it's a very valid negotiation strategy. I think the value of doing it is very obvious. My bias comes in that sometimes it puts everybody in an uncomfortable position because essentially what we're saying when we go through that process is as an employee, you're saying, I want to get paid more. I don't feel fairly compensated in my role, but I don't feel like you are going to give me a raise or a promotion or something that makes me feel fairly compensated for my responsibilities. So I need to go out somewhere else. I need to use somebody else essentially or another company to get leverage so that I can come back and try to get that raise sort of pulled out of you. My bias here is not that that's not a good strategy because it certainly can work quite well in many circumstances. My bias in the situation is more that that suggests a breakdown in communication or breakdown in expectations between an employee and their employer. I think it's very important that companies are clear about the career path and progression available to their employees, or if there isn't, that they're just very clear about that. Hey, this is sort of a terminal position. There's nowhere you can go with this particular position unless you go to school or do something that gives you different qualifications. And in turn, for employees, I think it behooves them to just clearly communicate with their management to say, hey, I'm interested in moving up. I'm interested in doing more. Or what can I do above my current position or in addition to my current position to be worthy of promotions or bonuses or something that helps bridge that gap. So all of that to say, it's a very strong negotiating strategy to try to get another offer to leverage against your current company, because then you either get the raise or you just take the job and you get the raise anyway. On the other side of that, I dislike what it says about the quality of the professional relationship between the employer and the employee, that you have to go that direction to get it done.
Yeah, that's true. A lot easier to just go them and talk to them about it.
Well, no, I do actually want to push back on that. It's hard. It is hard to look at your boss and say, "Hey, I want a raise," particularly if it's outside of something like a review cycle where a raise might be sort of expected or part of the conversation anyway. But it is sometimes a necessity. Sometimes the demand for certain positions or certain fields grows rapidly, where people who are hired last year get paid less than people who are hired this year because the demand cycle has changed. Now, I think smart companies account for that and accommodate that and make adjustments to the salary and pay scales that they offer to their team over time. But in turn, sometimes you're saying, "Hey, I'm worth a lot more than I'm being paid. I want to raise, and the money just isn't there. The budget isn't there. The revenue isn't there to support it. And then that puts everybody in an awkward position because they might want to give it to you, but they may not be able to give it to you. So, again, I think this comes back to clear expectations and clear communication, but just recognizing sometimes it's not personal. I know a bank manager recently who had somebody essentially ask for a raise like on a Tuesday afternoon via email, and by Wednesday morning essentially came to the boss and said, I'm quitting and I'm going somewhere else because you didn't give me that raise. And the boss was like, I was going to give it to you, you just literally didn't give me any time. So again, communication is really the key here. I think for anybody listening and trying to just pull out the takeaway here, takeaway number one: good, clear communication about career expectations as an employee or to your employees if you're the employer or the manager are very important. Number two, job shopping or interviewing to try to get an offer to leverage against your employer can be an effective strategy, but keep in mind that you are using another company in the process here, because if you then do that and get the offer accepted, or the leverage works, you've now wasted this other company's time and possibly stolen an opportunity from another person applying for that position. So that kind of sucks. And then other overall, again, just be cognizant that there are factors outside of you individually that can affect whether your desire for a raise or promotion is feasible or possible. Sometimes it's not you, sometimes it's just the company or something else in play.
Hmm. Well, that's all good information. Don't worry, Dan. I won't use it personally.
I fully expect to see a an offer from a competitor any day now that you're gonna leverage. I will actually. I do want to throw one more thing in here though, and I'll put this back to you a little bit. Have you ever tried any of that? And not you. I know you haven't done it here, but have you ever tried to like job shop or job hunt to try to get a better position where you already are?
No, because I feel guilty about it and bad that I'm wasting people's time and kind of screw them over. I just personally am not good at that. I have been on the other end when I owned a business here in town where people would interview with no intention of taking the job and waste a lot of my time, which I didn't appreciate. It was a pretty high turnover industry. I was hiring baristas for the coffee shop. Um, so they would come and go pretty frequently. That's just the way that is. And I spent a ton of time going over resumes and communicating with people and interviewing, and they had no intention of taking that job.
And that's a really tough spot to be as a small business owner, because your time is valuable and you put sort of a greater amount of emotional energy into what you do for your business. I do think something to keep in mind though, and it's a valuable thing to keep for anybody in any position in any organization, is a sort of reminder that from a business's standpoint, an employment relationship is much more mercenary in that you have a job so long as you are needed, or so long as you are valuable, or so long as there's a reason to have you. But companies, particularly bigger companies, will let you go in a heartbeat, right? And it may not be personal, it may be a big layoff or a divisional change or a spinoff or a merger or any number of things that can cause it that has nothing to do with your individual performance. And I do think it does behoove people in an employee relationship to keep that in mind when they think about their employer. In a small business, again, sometimes there's that whole like, oh, we're a family, and it might feel that way, and you may have great personal relationships, but at the end of the day, I do think anybody thinking about their own career, their own income, their own potential to really keep a little bit more of a mercenary spirit in mind. And I say that as the small business owner in this conversation, because that's certainly what I would advise my clients to do every time is, hey, if there's a better opportunity for you as your financial planner, unless there's a loss in your quality of life or your happiness or your sense of purpose and meaning in your work, if they're going to give you more, take more and don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, that's true. That is advice I give to someone regularly in my life that I know you know who it is, and it is super hard to do.
Well, hopefully they'll take it from you sometime, or they'll just see you do it and then they will learn from your example.
Maybe. We'll see. All right. Well, I have a second question, Dan. We've gotten off topic on this one, but now I want to talk about identity theft. We've talked about scams before here on this podcast, you and I, but like specifically identity theft is so much more common than I think people realize. I hear you say all the time to people, it's not if, it's when. Why is this specific thing so, I don't know, prevalent? It's everywhere.
Well, I think first and foremost, it's because the average American, and frankly, the average person anywhere, is not good at protecting their information, just in general. This is a byproduct of how frequently we are asked for it, and therefore how low of a significance we put on protecting it. So, I mean, just think about how many websites or platforms you essentially have to create like a username and password and login for. How many times you have to create a set of credentials to check out at an online shop or something because they won't send you the stuff you're trying to buy if you don't create an account. And so we tend to get very lazy. We tend to reuse things like passwords. We tend to give out our email too easily for a 10% coupon. And so our information is out there. We also quite willingly share our information through things like social media. So, Facebook and Instagram and all the other platforms are great for connecting and understanding and seeing the highlights of people's lives or learning about the challenges they're undergoing. But in turn, we are freely giving away enormous amounts of data about ourselves. And that is all reasonably innocuous. Learning that Emily likes tea so that she can be targeted by tea companies selling tea in advertisements is not hugely harmful, but in the sort of wear down of our willpower to be cautious about the information we share online or that we put on our computers, we then can very easily make mistakes. And then, from the standpoint of malicious actors, taking advantage of those mistakes is very, very easy. And the return on investment is very, very good. You have places like Russia that essentially have made hacking domestically illegal, but hacking people overseas perfectly legal. And so it's a legitimate business in a country like Russia to have a business that is entirely in the business of just stealing identities and, selling credit card numbers or social security numbers or something like that because it's a legal business there that has detrimental impacts to us here.
Hmm. Well, how are we supposed to protect ourselves then? Because, I mean, like you said, you kind of have to create accounts to shop here or log in there or download a ticket for something. You have to give them your information a lot of the time.
So I think things like kind of randomized password generators can be helpful, although that always creates a bit of a housekeep problem in which if you're not on your computer, you don't know how to log into your stuff or get into your stuff. I think learning about sort of good password setting theory is helpful. So, like a lot of people will do something like the name of their dog and their house number. So, like, oh, my dog is, Scruffy, and I live at 123 Street, and so my password for everything is Scruffy123. Well, it's a very short password. It's not very complicated or complex. It's easy for you to remember, and you can type it in quickly, but it's not a very good secure device. I think something like what happens with a lot of crypto wallets, where they go through sort of a combination of words, where the password inadvertently because of the style is essentially something like 50 characters long, can be very helpful. So this is something like having a combination of things like house exclamation mark street number 7 and like having 8 or 9 different words back to back, where you can remember it as a password because the words themselves are not complex, but because you've created an enormously long password that will take forever for a computer to try to brute force through if it's just trying to kind of crack it automatically or via an algorithm. And then beyond that, it is just being really, really mindful of how much information is shared and what tools you are using to try to protect that. So, do you use a identity blocker? Do you use a VPN? Are you using a password manager so that way you have super, super secure passwords? Generally speaking, of course, one of them recently got hacked into, so that sort of fell apart as a single point of failure. But just really being mindful about it as opposed to just trying to get through things quickly, because we're all a little bit impatient with this stuff because we do it so often. But I think mindfully approaching it and saying, okay, this is an exposure. I'm typing my social security into something, or I'm typing my name, my address, and my mother's maiden name into something. These are security questions. These are data points that somebody could use to get access to my stuff. I think it's a really big piece of it. And then I think from just a scam standpoint, the best advice I can give to anybody in protecting themselves from a scam is just slow down. Most times somebody is sending money to a malicious actor or being stolen from via a scam like an IRS phone scam where they're calling you and saying you owe a tax lien, and if you don't pay it right now you're going to jail. You can prevent almost all of that, if not all of that, simply by stopping and not listening to the person on the phone and really taking the time to just say like, okay, how likely is this, whatever this request is? I should talk to somebody else. I should ask my spouse. I should ask my friend, my coworker. All the way back when I worked at IBM, somebody got an IRS scam call, and they got all the way to the point of going to the credit union on campus, taking out $700, and they came to ask me, "Hey, can I go? I need to pay a tax bill." And that just sounded weird to me. And I asked them for the context, and they explained that they were on the phone with somebody who told them they needed to mail money somewhere. And at the end of the day, all they had to do, all that prevented them from having $700 stolen from them, was talking to somebody who was just skeptical enough to go, "That sounds weird to me. Let's dig at this a little bit more before you send somebody, all the money in your savings account." So all this to say, again, it's not a matter of if, but when. But we can protract the when quite a bit by being very deliberate and thoughtful about how we share information, what we give people access or businesses access to. And at any time that there's somebody prompting a transaction from us that we did not initiate, i.e., somebody asking you for money or demanding money, just slowing down and saying, I should get a second opinion on this before I just do what they say and suddenly I'm out all of my savings.
Right. Because they're pretty convincing a lot of the time. I know someone called my grandmother and tried to get her to like send money to her grandson. She thought it was him, and she didn't, because she said, well, that wouldn't be fair to the other grandkids. But she did believe the person and was, completely convinced it was her grandson on the phone, which, is a little off topic for identity theft, but they're pretty good at what they do.
Well, and part of this is it's a law of large numbers thing. So many people, many grandparents, right, can get a call from a young sounding person and could be convinced, but many are also not. Many of them are going to be like, well, I don't have a grandson, so this is obvious scam, or I know my grandson or granddaughter, whoever's voice, so this is obviously a scam. But for these scammers, typically many of them are overseas. Many of them have lower costs of living, and the risk reward quotient, again, is very skewed in their favor. So they're just going to persist. They're just going to keep coming after either one victim or multiple victims via multiple channels, because all they have to do is be successful once to get a pretty big payday. And so from that standpoint, again, just slowing things down and also just thinking about like the character of people. I think over a decade ago, my grandfather got a call that was supposedly from me saying like, "Hey, I'm in jail. Can you bail me out?" And my grandfather thought it was hilarious because I was in the army at the time. And just knowing my character, he knew that that would not be a thing that would happen to me. So just recognizing that at the end of the day, we have to really take ownership for it for ourselves. And again, that's just going to come down to being a little bit more thoughtful about how we convey ourselves in a world full of opportunities to take money from us via digital means or impersonal means.
I've seen that, ads for insurance to protect you against identity theft. Is that ever worth purchasing? I've not really looked into it before.
Maybe. I think it really depends on the exact policy you're looking at, the exact providers. Like there's like the LifeLock one that had the big commercials years ago. Some companies will include it as part of another policy where you just have like an identity theft rider included on your homeowners. There are specialty products out there like ID Shield, where it's both like computer monitoring and credit monitoring, but also insurance against theft or something like that. I think like any other insurable risk, it just becomes a question of how big is your potential exposure, how much money could be stolen from you, or how valuable is your identity in practice based on your income or your life, or the potential for somebody to take out a loan on your name or something like that. And how expensive is the premium, and do you think that's worth it? In that sense, I don't know that many identity protection insurances are too expensive to have. But in turn, I think you do just have to make more of a conscious risk reward decision about how concerned you are about that and what you potentially stand to lose if something happens. And then on the other side of that, because it's sort of a vague type of insurance, it's not like health insurance or auto insurance where there's a lot of regulation around it. Just being clear that you're paying for a product that has a good value to it and not just getting ripped off because you're concerned about something.
Yeah, I've seen some of the ads just say, you have access to an expert in recovering your identity. And that's all it says. Like, well, what does that mean? What are you going to do for me? And it doesn't really say anything more.
I think that expert is frankly probably somebody who works in a call center and just helps answer people's questions when this sort of thing happens. I think expert is probably overstating it almost universally. Because again, the type of business, the number of policies you'd have to sell to make it profitable, to then staff a call center, let alone hiring like actual, like I don't know, ex police detectives to fill this sort of thing is just not plausible. So I think more than likely you have maybe a handful of experts and a large call center of people who can kind of rubber stamp a lot of the issues that could arise. And then otherwise you're kind of on your own. I think again more than anything, I think insurance that could actually financially make you whole as opposed to like protect you in a strange situation is potentially more valuable here, just because at the end of the day, it's a risk, and the primary risk is the loss itself. And I think insuring the loss is probably more valuable in an insurance sense than trying to buy mitigation. Not saying mitigation isn't valuable, because you'd rather, have that ounce of prevention, pound of harm sort of trade off. But I don't know that the quality of those systems is generally very good.
Yeah. Well, if you do get your identity stolen, what should you do then? Is there a checklist of things you should do first, or how do you tackle that?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of what has been stolen or what exactly is being done here. Common kind of prophylactics here are things like freezing your credit so people can't borrow money. Making sure that you have different passwords or very secure passwords on all of your various logins and settings. But the second you're aware of something like a breach, canceling that credit card, or contacting that bank to say that that is not your account, becomes sort of an immediate step, and then kind of pruning off anything tangentially related to it. So like, your Best Buy account was hacked into, and somebody tried to buy a big screen TV in a state you don't live in. In that type of scenario, I think you have to look at that and go, okay, well, I need to obviously change the password on that account. And if there were any credit cards linked to that account, I probably need to cancel and reissue those and get different card numbers. If the password I used on that account is the same password that I used in other places, I should probably go reset those. And frankly, I should probably just go reset all of my passwords at this point, because now I'm running the risk that something is going to bleed over, or they have more than one point of access or password. And honestly, a really big area here is having authentication applications on your phone kind of reset or otherwise resecured, and also your email, because a lot of verification stuff runs through your email, and the kind of single points of failure we often have are these little blocks in our pockets that happen to have our email and various authenticators on them. If somebody gets into that, then that is essentially giving them the keys to the kingdom. So just being mindful that once there has been a breach, you sort of have to assume the whole house is burning down and try to put out a fire everywhere, versus just kind of squashing that one thing and assuming you're okay.
Right. I guess it's better to be thorough with everything.
Certainly.
I have a third question for you now. We're switching topics. Now I want to talk about children. I don't have any, but we do talk to people a lot about, how to set them up for the future. Sometimes they're very, very young kids and they ask, can I open an account for them, or this or that, or they're older, they're teenagers, and they want to teach them about their credit score or add them as an authorized user on their credit card. And they just have a lot of questions about what's the best way to educate their kids and set them up for success, which obviously it's very dependent on their situation, age of the child, etc. But what do you generally recommend to people?
So first and foremost, we sort of touched on this topic, or a part of this topic, a little while ago in a conversation with Daniel on the podcast. So I'll sort of point people to that as part of the conversation. I think in the particular context of the question you're asking here, the primary thing is, what are the lessons you're trying to impart? What is your capacity for risk as a parent? And what is appropriate as a tool at a certain stage of life? So, for example, when you have a child and they open a bank account before they're 18, typically as a parent you're going to have to co-sign that or guarantee that in some way, shape, or form. So if they overspend and there's overdraft fees, you are probably going to end up paying for those. If you make them a co-signer on your credit card where they can now use your line of credit, you can usually set a credit limit. But if they spend money and for some reason the bill doesn't get paid, that can come back to you. Or if they spend more than they're supposed to be spending, the money is spent, so it comes back to you. So there's some risk issues there. I think the best book I've ever read on sort of teaching money lessons to children, or at least older children, is The Opposite of Spoiled. Is a very good book. For very, very young children, I think Milton the Money Dog is a great children's book series. But in terms of then sort of the tools and what we would recommend, I think something like a bank account or a supplemental card. There are certain sort of app-based banking systems where you can put money on a card that gets used like a debit card, but it's not technically a bank, and you have sort of oversight as a parent. I think those sorts of things can be very useful as kids are kind of getting up to or around the age of 10. I think previous to that, using tangible money is valuable more for like the money skills, the ability to handle currency, count change, kind of do the basic addition and subtraction that goes with those types of transactions. Opening something like a credit card or giving them access to a line of credit to start building a credit history can be very valuable for them. I do think it's more valuable to put them on one of your cards that builds credit history through yours, so you have complete oversight and control of that payment, and making sure that they're not getting behind or missing any bills or something like that is valuable. I've also seen parents, add their kids to their credit card and then not give their kid the credit card, where they're just, putting them on there for their credit worthiness, but they're not actually trying to give them access to their credit. But I think all of this sort of builds. I think a more advanced version for some parents is giving their kids a much bigger allowance, but then making them much more responsible for paying certain expenses. Like, oh, we're going out to eat. If you want to come with us to go out to eat, 14-year-old child, you're going to pay for that out of your larger allowance, versus us just paying for you because you're part of the family. So I think it's different things that can be done like that, that people can apply. But I think the biggest thing is, parents know their children and they know what they probably are not ready for. So don't take my guidelines here as a sudden command to go put your kids in your credit card or open a bank account for them, because again, you know your children much better than I do on an individual level and what's good or bad for them there. The only thing I would caution around on this is, and this is where the conversation with Daniel comes in. Many parents impart bad financial lessons on their children, from an objective standpoint. So things like overspending or spending frivolously, or even little passive lessons. So things like, we always have to have new cars, that sort of thing. It doesn't mean you can't, but just recognize that even if you're not deliberately teaching your children something about money, you're not like sitting down and saying, okay, son, daughter, here's how you balance a checkbook or something very specific like that. You do need to keep in mind that your kids are constantly learning financial lessons from you everywhere, from how you pay for things, how you treat cashiers or waiters when you go to certain businesses and so on, whether you use cash, whether you use plastic, whether you use apps on your phone. All of that stuff is teaching your kids something passively. And keep in mind that then also even refusals to do things financially can teach your kids lessons. Saying things like, we can't afford that, or we're not buying that, or we don't have the money for that, can sometimes impart lessons about money that can have lifelong impacts, some good, some bad. So just recognize that whether you are deliberately teaching your kids about money, your kids are learning about money all the time.
All right. That kind of touches on the money scripts I know we've talked about earlier.
Yeah, and that would be sort of the definitional byproduct of some of these lessons. But money is learned about from parents, from peers, from siblings, from society, from content kids consume, from the media and ads they're presented with all the time. And this is where we get into the theory of financial socialization. So just recognizing again that at the end of the day, your kids are going to learn about money, so it behooves you to be deliberate in what you're trying to teach them.
Right. Do you recommend that parents help set up any sort of like retirement savings account, like much longer term planning for a child once they're able to?
I think many parents read about things like, well, if you set up a Roth IRA for your kid when they're born, they will, have $1 million by the time they're 21 or something. I think all of that stuff, pardon my French, tends to be bullshit. I think much of that is fraudulent and inappropriate. I think doing things like setting up investment accounts on your kids' behalf and helping, teaching your kids like what you're investing in for them, or letting them decide how they're going to invest $100 in that account or something, can be good life lessons. But when you are just trying to like open a Roth to make your kid a millionaire, and there's no actual basis for them having that Roth. They don't work in a way or earn an income in a way that would actually fund it. Then we're slipping into the territory of doing a nice thing for our kids at the risk of committing tax fraud, which the risk reward there is not good.
No, not very fun. All right. Well, that means we're at the end, so I know you have a question for me.
I always have a question for you, Emily. So, what is the most valuable thing you've learned since the last time you were on the podcast?
I think it's a lesson that I've learned many times, but it's always important. I've said it before, I'm pretty sure on this podcast, but you have to have an accurate picture of your own personal finances. We encounter people every day that they think they do. And I've done this as well, where you're like, no, I know how much I spend on eating out or clothes or whatever. I've got a good grasp on it. But then if you actually go through their transaction history or go through their plan, sometimes you're off by a lot. You don't have like a good idea of what you actually spend. And that makes such a big difference now. And in long-term planning, I would encourage everyone once again to actually dig into the numbers, once a year. You don't have to do it all the time, but what are you spending? Where is your money going?
Great advice. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.